morning, everyone. To those of you who are here joining me in Stratansky Hall, thank you for coming out on this cold morning. I'm glad that you could be here. And for those of you who are here with us on Zoom this morning, I'm glad that you could be here from home, in your bed, in your pajamas, your cat. If you are following on Zoom, please make sure that you've muted your account. And when we get to the question and answer period at the end, that's when you can unmute yourself and ask questions, and hopefully that will go smoothly. So the title of this presentation is, Will the Real MLK Please Stand Up? Misappropriations of Dr. King by the Right and the Left. As I was putting it together, however, I decided that this was the wrong approach. As is often my tendency, and perhaps this is true for many of you, I was going with a this view is right versus this view is wrong sort of approach. By focusing on misappropriations, I was preparing to tell you how different people were wrong in how they understood Dr. King, and then I would tell you about my correct interpretation. Now, sometimes that approach is completely appropriate. However, I don't think it is today, and especially not with Martin Luther King Jr. One of my favorite things about Dr. King is the generosity of spirit that he so often displayed. I spoke about this last year at this teach-in. King would read a book, listen to a speaker, assess an individual's actions, and then critically differentiate what he thought was valuable and what was not, where he agreed and where he disagreed. This is, after all, the best way to grow in wisdom. But too often we accept or reject people and their ideas as a whole, rather than trying to distinguish the chaff from the wheat. Dr. King appreciated the works of Hegel, the 19th century philosopher, and Hegel talked about the importance of a thesis and its antithesis coming together in dialogue, whereupon progress may be made toward reaching a synthesis which offers a greater insight into the truth. I think we need more of this in higher education today. Now, this is not to say that MLK or I would have trouble telling some people that they are completely wrong about certain things. He certainly did that at times. And later you will be hearing from Dr. Nick Clark, who I have often told at the lunch table that he was completely wrong about one thing or another. But this morning, instead of talking about misappropriations, I'm going to depart a bit from the original plan and talk to you instead about what I think the right and the left, conservatives and liberals, often miss when speaking about King and his legacy. And in the spirit of dialectic, after my talk, we have both the respondent and the opportunity for questions and answers, for comments and critiques from the audience. And if you think my perspective on any of this is off base, I hope you'll tell me and we can talk about it. I would like to begin by discussing what I think conservatives miss when looking at the life and legacy of Dr. King. And I think it's one big thing. As you probably know, conservatives very often have a great appreciation for the man and his ideas. And you know their favorite King quote? You know what their favorite King quote is? You all know it. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And how could you not love that line? It's beautiful. However, conservatives are criticized, and rightly so at times, for dwelling on that one line and not understanding it in the larger context of King's thought. It becomes easy to say, well, that's the way I live my life, judging others by their character and not by their color, and therefore I've done my part. Amen. The problem is that Dr. King, following the teachings of Jesus, was a golden rule guy. He was not a silver rule guy. You'll recall that the golden rule says, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, while the silver rule says, do not do unto others what you would not have done unto you. That is, the silver rule tells you not to do bad things to people. The golden rule tells you that you've got a responsibility to go out there and do good things for others. And King was a golden rule kind of guy. Not being racist is not enough. Now, very quickly, I should clarify that when I'm using the words racism and racist, I'm doing so the way that King did, with regard to the belief that one race or ethnicity is superior to another, and those who discriminate on the basis of that belief then would be racists. Those who think that one's moral responsibilities with regard to race relations end once you're not racist are clearly at odds with the message of Dr. King. And one need look no further than his letter from Birmingham Jail, although it can be found numerous other places as well. There he wrote, "I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice." When I was a freshman at Kenyon College, I remember that we had a gathering in the lounge of my dorm to discuss race relations. I remember where I was sitting, but I don't remember anything else, except for one comment. A classmate of mine, Rita, young Black woman, stood up and challenged us. And I don't remember the exact words that she used, but as I recall, the essence of it was this. She said, "You might not be racist or do anything racist, but that's not enough, because I still face racism and unfair treatment out there from other people. You need to do more than simply not be racist. You need to get involved and work with me to change the world for the better." And I remember being taken aback by that comment, thinking about it, struggling with it. And the fact that I'm still thinking about that challenge 32 years later means that something worth saying was said. So Rita, if you happen to come across this video, thank you for making that comment all those years ago. It was very much appreciated. And I think King would agree with her. At the same time, this observation can go in a problematic direction. Life is usually more complicated than dividing people into two categories: the good and the bad, the right and the wrong, the racist and the anti-racist. So there are 3 quick points that I would like you to consider. First, I believe that King differentiated 3 different groups, not 2, with regard to this issue. There were those who fought for justice, there were those who fought for injustice, and there were those who were sitting on the sidelines. Now, King did not shy away from criticizing that 3rd group, but he didn't lump them in with a 2nd either. An overly cautious or cowardly minister who refused to take a stand for justice was a bird of a different feather than someone like Bull Connor. Or for those of you who know the famous quote by Martin Niemöller, first they came for the socialists, ... When Niemöller chastised himself for not taking a stand earlier against the Third Reich, he was not suggesting thereby that he was essentially a Nazi. So I think we need to identify 3 groups. The second point is this, and it's related to the first. There's a growing trend to say that you are either actively working as an anti-racist or you're a racist. Some of you may be familiar with the works of Ibram X. Kendi. One problem here is, what is anti-racist? Is it defunding the police? Or is it providing more resources for better running police departments? Is it raising the minimum wage so the working poor who are disproportionately Black will make more money? Or keeping it steady so we won't increase unemployment, especially in entry-level jobs? If you ask me what programs will help improve racial justice in America and which will make things worse, you'll get a very different answer than if you ask President Green. Which one of us is racist? Which one of us is anti-racist? And who gets to decide? The third consideration is this. When we castigate those who are not actively involved in working against racism, we have to ask ourselves, what if they're busy with other things? Now, I don't mean that they are busy playing video games or shopping or something like that. What I mean is there are those who are very active in other important projects. If someone is not active in fighting racism because her time and resources are being directed toward helping people with mental illness, is she at fault? If she's busy raising money to support anti-slavery efforts around the world, is she required to add anti-racism to her schedule or else be labeled a racist? Now, in the case of King and his letter from Birmingham Jail, I think it's a bit different. He was writing to local leaders at a time when things were really coming to a head in that city. This was one of those times that people needed to stand up and be counted. And failing to speak or suggesting that everyone just slow down was to clearly take a position on fundamental issues affecting human rights in that city at that time. If we turn now to what those on the left often miss from the life and teaching of Dr. King, I think it's helpful to look at two big lessons that can be drawn from the Albany movement. Albany, Georgia was another city where segregationists were in battle with Blacks who were marching for their rights and utilizing King's strategy of nonviolence. They were challenging the practices of discrimination in public places, the denial of the right to vote, school segregation, and unconstitutional barriers to free speech and assembly. And King came to Albany and was part of the efforts there. While he was there, he was arrested for parading without a permit, disturbing the peace, and obstructing the sidewalk. He refused to pay the fine and spent Christmas of 1961 there in jail. The difficulties persisted through the next year, and on July 24th, brutal force was unleashed on the peaceful demonstrators. Unfortunately, there were some among the Black population that responded with violence and destruction. Now, while some good did come out of the Albany movement, King recognized that mistakes had been made, mistakes that he did not want to see repeated in the future. One of these was strategic. King later reflected that part of the reason that Albany was not a success, like the Montgomery bus boycott had been a success, was that the protest was not focused enough on specifics. He wrote, "If I had that to do again, I would guide that community's Negro leadership differently than I did. The mistake I made there was to protest against segregation generally, rather than against a single and distinct facet of it. Our protest was so vague that we got nothing, and the people were left very depressed and in despair. It would have been much better to have concentrated upon integrating the buses or the lunch counters." Now, the Montgomery bus boycott had been a success because of the strength, the courage, and the determination of the community. However, they also had very specific demands that they wanted to have met. And so everyone knew precisely what was being fought for, what the goal was, and what victory would look like. Now, in 2020, there were a lot of protests with regard to race relations in the United States and around the world. Many of these had to do with policing, but not all. However, protesting often appeared to be an end in itself. What would victory look like? What specific changes were being sought? Without particulars, what we saw were a lot of efforts at window dressing to address the pent-up aggression and frustration that was being expressed in various communities around the country. In 1967, addressing an audience at Stanford University, King remarked, "True integration is not merely a romantic or aesthetic something where you merely add color to a still predominantly white power structure." I think this is what we saw a lot of in 2020. Specific underlying dynamics that perpetuate racial inequity were not clearly addressed. Often we saw token efforts that aid middle and upper class Blacks, but make little, if any, difference for poor Blacks in America who bear the brunt of racial discrimination. And this can also lead to another problem. Very often there are conservatives who respond to the vague and abstract descriptions of systemic racism by looking around and saying, "I don't see this racism that you're talking about." Of course, we know that racism, racial discrimination, and the long-term effects of those are not always apparent when we look around. And that, of course, doesn't mean that they're not real. However, it is incumbent upon those who are talking about these matters and trying to change things for the better to deal in concrete particulars. Overly general references to structural racism are about as helpful as complaining about society or the man. They may get you some echoed approval from the choir, but they're not going to help you change things. What are needed are public policy prescriptions. Specifics about redlining in American history and its effects today. Specifics about racially disparate criminal sentencing and what precisely needs to be changed. specifics about discrimination in hiring and what steps could be taken to minimize it. These can be helpful approaches. Hazy references to the racism all around us won't accomplish much and will eventually lead to people tuning you out. Now, this brings us to the second lesson of Albany. When working to try and improve racial equity in America, no group is exempt from criticism. All of us can be doing better. When certain people responded to violence with violence, King would have none of it. It didn't matter that they had the same goals. What they did was wrong. After the destruction of rioting in Albany, King strongly condemned their actions. While we are certain that neither the peaceful demonstrators nor persons active in the Albany movement were involved in the violence that erupted last night, we abhor violence so much that when it occurs in the ranks of the Negro community, we assume part of the responsibility for it. Now, this was not just some boilerplate repudiation of violence, which we heard far too often in 2020, but a serious rejection of such an approach and a willingness to take responsibility for it. King even called for a day of penance in the Black community. And after that, he decided that there needed to be a change from larger marches to smaller protests in front of City Hall because of the tension in the town. King did not only reject violence because it would be counterproductive to the ends that he sought, but also because he believed it was unequivocally wrong. And he didn't pass the buck. When violence did erupt in connection with the civil rights movement, he condemned it without reservation and sought to determine how he could reduce it in the future. He didn't explain it away as a small number of bad actors, but went so far as to place some of the blame on himself. Now, it is true that King's insistence on nonviolence can be misinterpreted as a weak approach or an agreeable and gradualist strategy. Malcolm X had that problem with King. There are some more conservative folks who don't want to see any hubbub in the streets, and some radicals who always seem to want more. But as the life and work of King make clear, his moral prescription requires more action, more courage, more sacrifice, more integrity, more thoughtfulness, and more introspection than we see today. This is a bold challenge for bold action. Today, there are too many of us going through our lives simply trying to avoid harming anyone else and then call it a day. This was not King's vision. There are others who just want to tear this mother down, and that is not King's vision either. For any of us to pay tribute to this great man, we need to do exactly what he did. We need to find out what is really going on out there. We need to educate ourselves by reading the greats. We need to work with others, tackling specific instances of injustice. We need to keep vigil on ourselves, our egos, and our tempers. And we need to find a source of hope and motivation to keep us going. For King, this was his deep, abiding faith in the gospel of Jesus Christ. He understood that others would find it elsewhere, but he knew this was more than a political struggle. It was a spiritual one. To follow the lead of King is to identify absolute moral principles, to strive to live according to them, and to demand, insofar as the law is concerned, that others do the same. And if doing so requires a passive rejection of unjust laws and injunctions, well, as he wrote from Birmingham, we do this not out of any disrespect for the law, but out of the highest respect for the law. This is not an attempt to evade or defy the law or engage in chaotic anarchy. We believe in a system of law based on justice and morality. Out of our great love for the Constitution of the U.S., and our desire to purify the judicial system of the state of Alabama, we risk this critical move with an awareness of the possible consequences involved. Thank you. Now, I believe that Dr. Nick Clark from the Political Science Department will be responding.
Can you all hear me? Can you hear me?
You need me to mute
Dr. Mann?
myself? Okay.
If somebody there can hear me, can you type in chat? I'm afraid maybe they're in the auditorium, they can't, but the rest of you can. Yep, okay. So I would like to start just by thanking the MLK Planning Committee for planning all of today's events, including this one, and providing a forum to talk about these things. I want to thank Dr. Mann for his talk, for conceiving of this, and especially for sharing his comments with me ahead of time, because that allows certainly a much fuller response. I have, in general, 4 responses. In some ways, some of them are refuting certain points that he makes, but I think in a lot of ways, they're just sort of responding to some of the ideas in his talk and some of the ideas that he's getting to. And I will just say at the beginning that I am not a scholar or an expert in MLK or in critical race theory. I'm still responsible for everything I say here, but I put that out there so that I don't mislead anyone into thinking that at the start. So as I said, there's 4 main reactions I have, and I'm going to try and get through them quickly because I know Dr. Mann wants to allow time for the rest of you to ask questions as well. But the first really concerns conceptualizations and his approach to sort of conceptualizing different categories for organizing people. So here he's working with conceptual categories like liberal and conservative, with left and right, with racist and anti-racist. And I don't think that's overly problematic, in that it does provide at least some baseline for us all to have a discussion. And he's using these labels in part because they're used elsewhere. And as well, I think it's drawing on clear concepts as a way of facilitating discussion. But I do think that generally there are problems with categorizations like what he's establishing here, some of which he acknowledges in his own talk. So first is that many people reject the categories of the labels, even the labels that might be assigned to them. For instance, I've noticed even increasingly that there are people that are rejecting the labels of conservative or liberal. That's something that we in fact encountered in a course I taught last fall with a survey that we had that was very much anchored in standard survey methodology, with some students saying, well, some might place me as conservative or liberal, but I don't identify as that at this point because my political beliefs are too dynamic and complex. And so it's really a mischaracterization. And as he himself points out, the question of who decides what falls under a particular label is really problematic. He raises the question here, he raises the question often, who decides who is racist or anti-racist, who is liberal or conservative. You know, it's a question that can be raised in literally any situation where expertise is at the center of it, but it is a valid thing still to say that. But I think then it becomes problematic, though, because those categories are sort of structuring much of the discussion that he's providing here. But the larger issue, I guess, I think I'd raise with these conceptualizations, and I say this as a social scientist, I think that these things fall far more along a continuum than they do as sort of these dichotomous categories. People are rarely one thing or another. They're much more likely to be more or less of a particular thing, and that's likely to change over time. Someone may become more or less liberal or conservative over time, for instance. And if you take the ideas of racist and anti-racist, you know, my understanding of critical race theory and systematic racism is that that would be a false dichotomy, because most, if not all of us, are subject to racial biases and assumptions, meaning that most of us would fall under the category of racist, at least at one time or another, if not at most times. And many of us may also at different times fall under the category of anti-racist, depending on how we choose to behave. So, you know, these ideas, these racist assumptions and biases are embedded within us, just as they are embedded within the institutions that shape us. And we're not then simply one or the other at that point. And to give you one example of that, he does talk about many of the events that occurred in the last year. When the recent insurrection took place at the Capitol, I myself had a fairly degree of moral outrage in response to that. And I've had many friends and colleagues, including those that go back to high school and some here at SU, that have pointed out to me that, you know, having the United States involved in efforts to undermine democratic governments has been quite commonplace for decades in other parts of the world. Where was the moral outrage then? Where was my moral outrage at those moments? You know, and so there are really these assumptions embedded within all of us. And I think part of being anti-racist, part of it, at least my interpretation, is remaining mindful of those and trying to account for those as we move along. I think Dr. Mann would tell you that others make these classifications. He is in many ways reacting against them as much as he is employing them. And he's right that across the spectrum, we all have a tendency to do this. So I offer this not merely just as a reaction against his talk, but that I think these simple and blunt classifications are far rarer than he assumes. I do think most people are mindful of the fact that as human beings, we're more complex than that. And more to the point, I don't think the theory or scholarship or literature motivating much of this is often that blunt. The second point I want to talk about are social movements, because that's key to what he's talking about here. And first, I'd say I don't think social movements are as easy to define or are as immutable as they're often treated. People often treat social movements as unitary organizations in of themselves. But movements like these are often much more loose organizations or networks of different groups that have some shared goals, but often have different goals and different tactics. Second, the strategies and tactics that movements use are going to change over time because they're context specific. So specifically the types of injustice that a particular social movement is addressing, the institutional constraints on change, meaning the extent to which prevailing social, political, and economic systems allow that movement to react, and the broader resources that are available to mobilize in response vary dramatically from one time point to the next. And so, you know, the movement that existed in the 60s is not the same as the movement that exists today. And we definitely need to remain mindful of that. I cannot speak to Dr. King and what he would have thought about today's events or the events of the last year. To be quite honest, I don't think anyone can. I am, as I said, definitely not a scholar of his works, but there are those that are a scholar of his works that tell me he was a very complex man with evolving thoughts and impulses. What I am more confident of is that his speeches and his writings and his actions can certainly provide inspiration to us, but we have to be careful about mobilizing on them to critically analyze and judge the actions of the movement today, because that movement is in a very different place. I do think that there's a lot of potential error in taking the thoughts and actions of a leader at one point in a movement and using it to judge that movement at another time. The third point is, in our history as a country, we've often looked at other places in which a movement was challenging institutional authority, and we have praised those movements. The uprisings against the Soviet Union throughout Eastern Europe, Tiananmen Square, the Arab Spring. These are all things that are generally regarded as positive in our minds and in our discussions, and all represent the actions of aggrieved groups. However, keep in mind that most authoritarian regimes allow certain liberties and levels of prosperity to citizens, but also include systematic abuses against particular groups, lack of any sort of rule of law, and support for an unfair distribution of resources. Many persons of color in the United States today confront the very reality in this country that many groups are struggling against in other countries. I believe that systematic racism exists, as Dr. Mann acknowledges in his talk, that police brutality is disproportionately directed at people of color, that white supremacy is growing in the country right now, and that persons of color live under threat. If you accept that, then you have to at least imagine and allow that as a social movement, the effort to establish equality will make use of an array of tools and strategies. And let me say right here, I don't hold that these beliefs simply because of what I see or read or hear in the media. I have friends who live in this reality, who experience this every day, and who tell me about the things that are said or done to them. It is real. It is not just something that's read online. Finally, Dr. Mann advances the argument that anti-racists should share information with as much specifics as possible, particularly with that third group he identifies, those who are not racist or anti-racist, but are simply not involved in the discussion because they have other injustices that they're pursuing or other goals that are dominating. I would offer some caution on this point. I understand where he's coming from here. I think that his intent is real and true, but I think that there's some danger in the advice there. Because first of all, I think on the part of that third group he's talking about, there has to be at least some willingness to look. It can't be an obligation that anti-racists seek them out proactively to inform them at all times about what's going on. They have to be willing to go out there and ask for the information or find it. And I think if they do, that they'll find that information is there. I think there are plenty of resources now, including resources that have been provided by SU as part of the census, to document and provide evidence and resources for responding to incidents of racism. But more to the point, I think we have to be cautious in asserting a demand that people of color talk about their experiences with racism. I believe that experiences with racism are a form of trauma for many. And there's no other group of individuals who have experienced such forms of trauma that then have an obligation to relive that trauma on an ongoing basis. We don't seek out veterans or the survivors of sexual assault or the families of victims and shootings and say, you need to talk about these and basically relive them in doing so that broader society can be educated. Certainly when they are willing to do that, that is to the benefit of us all and we learn from it, but we don't assert that obligation there, and I think we have to be careful about doing it. Instead, and I'm leaning heavily on discussions I've had with Michael Dixon, the CDO here at SU, so I want to give credit to him for this. I think learning about these experiences first requires an effort to build relationships on the part of anti-racists or people in this third group that Dr. Mann identifies either one. But that's a foundation for sharing experiences in both directions. It can't just be this sort of blind demand that's put out there. First, there has to be relationships built between people, and that may then facilitate an exchange of experiences and information in the way that he's asking. So those are my 4 points, and I'll apologize to Dr. Mann that I went a little longer than I told him I would with this, but I do think that there's plenty of time left still for broader discussion. Again, I thank you, Jeff, and I thank the committee for putting this together.
Thank you, Nick. I didn't even notice that you went long. Your comments were so thoughtful and engaging that I was so focused that you probably think I'm being sarcastic, but I'm serious. I appreciate. I'm normally sarcastic with you, but I honestly thought that was very, very helpful. Thank you. I think maybe the best way to handle this is we will maybe go back and forth. If there are people on Zoom and people in the room who might want to ask questions, we'll just try this first. If there's anyone here in the Zoom call who would like to unmute themselves, we'll do one person on Zoom and then see if anyone in the audience and then back. So is there anyone here on the Zoom call who would like to make a comment, ask a question, raise a critique?
If I may, Jeff and Nick, this is Rachna Sachdev.
Yes, please, go ahead.
Okay, so you referenced Ibram Kendi in the beginning, and I taught the text last semester, so I'm very familiar with it. And one of the most important points that he makes in the book is the point that Nick Clark brought up. No one is an anti-racist or a racist. We have anti-racist moments. We have racist moments. We make decisions that are anti-racist or not. And when he's going through the text, he also talks about the ways in which homophobia is aligned with racism, right? So he talks about how he was a racist and how he learned, to strive not to be racist anymore. But then he uses that category not in a very narrow sense, but in order to fight about injustice everywhere. And I think part of what you were talking about, there are no people who are either they're making decisions that are just decisions or they're making decisions that are unjust decisions. So I think part of what we might want to consider is that the third category is not very useful, because if you're all both racist and anti-racist, and we can strive to be more on the side of justice, then the third category is not as useful to me, at least. Thank you. Thank you both for your wonderful comments as well.
Thank you. I should have muted myself during her question. I hope that's fine. Okay. For those of you asking questions from Zoom, because where I'm standing in this building, it's a little hard for me. So I might have to ask you to repeat things, but I think I got everything Dr. Sasjev raised. I think both she and Nick talked about this in relation to Kendi, and I won't talk too long about this, but give my quick reaction. I think, and as I spoke about, I think we, of course, need to be careful about categorizing people as good people and bad people. Now, there are good people and bad people in the world, but we can oversimplify things into, are you on my side or the bad side? And people are more complex than that. People are a mix of vices and virtues. When it comes to racism, I think that a lot of times when people say everyone is racist and anti-racist at times, that's making use of a definition of racism that I find problematic. I think that as you play it out, it ends up leading to a lot of more confusion than clarity. Dr. Clark mentioned, equated racial bias with racism. So do we all have some racial bias? Sure, we have all sorts of bias. We have bias on the basis of politics and music preference and attractiveness and height and weight and all sorts of things. But I would differentiate between racial bias that I might feel and racism. I think when we lump those together, we minimize what racism is really about when we look at the history of the world and what has been done in the name of the traditional notion of racism. The other aspect is that one of my concerns with Kendi does offer specifics, so I have to give him credit for that. When Kendi writes, he gives specific proposals, but there's too much in my reading of him. Here are the specific policy proposals that I would like to make. If you get on board with them, then you are anti-racist. If you are not on board with these, then you are racist or you are acting racist. But what if I look at some of these and I think, well, no, I don't think that's the best way to approach it. There's too much of you need to get on board with my specific political agenda to be anti-racist. Otherwise, you are racist or you're acting racist. And I find that problematic. Is there anyone in the audience who it might be easy for me just to repeat the question if they ask one. Is that okay? I think we're getting some reverberation. Okay, I'm guessing that audio didn't make it into the Zoom call. So the question was, and let me know if I get this correct, that there's a concern that if you say you got to have specifics, right? Does everyone who decides to go and attend a protest or attend a march have to have specific policy proposals, right? Isn't there something to be said for people coming together to express outrage or concern or whatever the issue might be? So yes, I don't disagree with that at all, right? And so there are times that people want to just go in the march because they are communicating, I'm very unhappy with this situation. A number of years ago, some people probably on this call and in this room may remember when there was someone scrawled, I believe it was a swastika on a car at the synagogue in Sunbury. And the community gathered together and just went there to support the synagogue, and there were no specific policy proposals. So I'm not suggesting that you always have to have it, and if I walk up to anyone at a gathering and be like, give me your top 5, right? But I think absent specific policy proposals, you're not going to be able to achieve much. And, as King says in Albany, it's fine to get everyone out there marching and concerned about segregation. But if the movement as a whole does not have specific policy proposals in addition to that, then you're not going to be able to achieve stuff. And all you're going to get is window dressing or these aesthetic changes. So going out to express, concern, frustration in a general sense, fine. But what needs to follow from that are some specific things, or it's just going to come to naught. That's my perception of the issue. Okay, so I need to watch this. I guess we have 4 or 5 minutes. Would anyone else on the Zoom call like to make any comments or raise any questions?
I kind of have a follow-up to what was previously said about the having specific policies. As a general sense, and this has happened in like some different LGBTQ groups that I've seen as well, there's kind of just a sense that the entire system needs an overhaul, and you can very much say that you don't have any advice for this, but do you have any advice on like where would be a good place to start, or is it just kind of
Let's see. Well, yeah, thanks, Steph, for your question. No, I don't. I mean, there are people with different personalities, and Dr. Clark pointed this out, and he's absolutely right. Liberal and conservative are overgeneralizations. They're helpful generalizations to use from time to time, but they're overgeneralizations. And you have people who tend by psychology to take a more slow, cautious approach. And you have people who want to, radically change things right now. And those certainly correlate with conservative and liberal political agendas. When there's a notion of we need to overthrow the whole system, when someone raises that, and whether it be with regard to how we address issues of sexual identity or race, my reaction generally is, okay, but you got to tell me what you're going to do and why it's going to be better. And maybe this is just the way I approach things. I'm like, well, you got to give me some specifics. The whole sort of tear the mother down, and we'll get it fixed up in no time because we're enthusiastic. I don't find persuasive. For me, I want to hear specifics. What do you want to change? And if it is a huge radical change, okay, but propose it in specific language so I can respond to the suggestion. So for Steph, that's for me is how I look at that. And I know that not everyone does, but that's how I would look at that challenge. Okay, if I remember correctly, we go to 9:45. Is there anyone else in the audience who?
Dr. Mann, I would just, because this has come up a couple times, I would say that I do think that there are more specifics asserted than sort of what's being assumed in the discussion. I mean, I think that there are tangible proposals for policy changes. They may be ones that some people disagree with, but you allude to some of them in your talk. I think that even the movement itself has very, at least some elements of it, very specific agenda points that they're pursuing. I think that there are examples of both the sort of racism you're talking about, as well as I think more subtle racial biases that are cited all the time. So, I guess I don't particularly accept that this is a discussion that's always advanced in the abstract in a way that's difficult to know what's really being talked about.
Okay. Ariana, I see you raised your hand, but can you please just unmute yourself? And
Yeah, sure. So first, thank you guys for putting this together. It was extremely informational, but I do have one question. What would you say about the people, I guess more in regard to the events that happened with the Black Lives Matter protests and everything? I think that their frustrations stem from the fact that they feel like they're falling on like unheard ears, like nobody's listening when it comes to the people within certain administrations. So how would you, sorry about that, hold on. How would you respond to something like that, where it seems like the people who do have some kind of suggestions for different policies, how would you respond to that when people just aren't listening?
Mm-hmm. That ties in, I think, with Dr. Clark's previous comment. There are certainly people out there with specific proposals. As I mentioned, Kendi has ones that he makes. I've been listening lately to Coleman Hughes, who's a very interesting guy with some very interesting ideas. So there are people with specific ideas and proposals. And you also have, as the question referred to earlier, people who are out there with general concerns and want to see general changes, but don't have specific policy proposals in mind. I think when the group, like, this is a big topic, but when you look at the Black Lives Matter movement, in one sense, it's a quasi-organization, and in another, it's I know that scientists get mad when we say this, an organic movement that's happening that is very diverse. So with regard to your question, I think if you have a large group of people who do not put forward specific proposals and essentially agree with one another, it's going to be hard to make anything change. And so Dr. Clark's right. When King was doing things at that time, it was a very different world. And so he could go into Montgomery and organize a specific protest about a specific issue and orient everyone around that, that agenda, and it could be covered in national news. But that's not what we're seeing with recent protests about racial relations in the United States. And I think, I don't have the answers, but it is a fundamental challenge that when you have something so big and amorphous, how do you get something accomplished? And I think people need to figure out what they want to really rally around and make that happen, or make it local. I know that's not the greatest answer, but I would say you're going to need specifics either at a national level or at a local level, because generalizations make it hard for anyone to, not impossible, but they make it hard for anyone to really make specific changes. I'm mindful of the time. I believe we're supposed to go 45 minutes, and I've gone 2 minutes over and infuriated some of you. So thank you for coming. Thank you for all folks who help make this possible, who organize this event every year, to Jesse Knights, who helped with the technology, and Dr. Clark, and those of you who contributed today. Thank you, and I hope to see many of you around campus soon.